Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So I'm very excited for today's episode because I'm gonna discuss one of my favorite studies, which is the Adapted to Flee Famine hypothesis by Dr. Guisinger. So the paper is called Adapted to Flee Famine, Adding an Evolutionary Perspective on Anorexia Nervosa. This study specifically touches upon anorexia nervosa, but a lot of what is being discussed in this study and in this hypothesis is also relevant for other eating disorders, or for example, bulimia and restrictive eating disorders in general. I would say that a lot of it applies. But I will use the word anorexia just because that is the word, anorexia nervosa, because that is the word that the author of the paper is using, right? So first off, let me just quickly summarize the core message of this paper in my own words, right? Because essentially what I'm going to try and do here with this paper is trying to translate it in a way that is a bit more understandable, maybe for people who don't have a scientific background or have a research background. Of course, even though you maybe don't have that background, if you're still someone who's very interested in reading scientific papers, I definitely recommend checking out the paper and reading it. It is available for free online. If you search for Adapted to Flee Famine, Guisinger, it should come up on Google as a PDF that you can open. And you can also check out adaptedtofleefamine.com. I do want to say that this is, a hypothesis or a theory rather than something that's been 100% proven, but that is also essentially, when it comes to the field of eating disorders in general, that is most of the studies around eating disorders, right? And I would argue that this has a lot more scientific basis than a lot of the other more outdated things you see about eating disorders, more of the Freudian takes that an eating disorder is some kind of, repressed desire to XYZ, right? Which you hear a lot, which is sometimes even being presented as a fact, which I strongly disagree with. In my opinion, as someone who is an avid reader of research when it comes to eating disorders, I find that this is something that is probably one of the most interesting takes and interesting perspectives I've seen, and also something that I feel resonates a lot with my own background, both as someone who has had anorexia and also someone who worked with people with eating disorders. And when I discuss this theory with people with eating disorders, one of the things that very often I hear is, oh my God, that makes so much sense. That really explains it, right? So especially if you are a provider, an eating disorder treatment professional, I also recommend checking this out. So part why I want to discuss this study a bit is because I find that people with eating disorders, people in recovery from eating disorders, they are usually very interested in learning more about what on earth is going on with them. And very often the mainstream narratives just doesn't quite fit 100%. For example, I was never really been someone who was like hyper focused on my body and someone who is very, very obsessed with being skinny. That was never me, right? I do understand that maybe some people with eating disorders experience, but in my case, that was never really it. And also, even if it were about the desire to be extremely skinny, then it wouldn't necessarily explain all the other bizarre behaviors that we see in people with anorexia. So example of that behavior would be denial of severity of illness, an inner sense of restlessness and urges to move. Some people have this. I didn't actually personally have that, but a lot of people do have that. And also this strange food obsession where it becomes, about saving recipes, hoarding food, being obsessed with using certain spoons, right? This like OCD-like behavior around food. If it was exclusively about a desire to wanting to be thin, it wouldn't necessarily explain all of these other behaviors. And also, if it was exclusively about a desire to be thin, then you would assume that, okay, the person with an eating disorder is very obsessed with being thin for superficial reasons, but then wouldn't that translate to a general concern about appearance, a general, I guess, superficiality, if that's even a word? Or why is it that someone only cares about their appearance when it comes to thinness, but the same people may not necessarily care about, having their hair done or having their makeup done, all of these things, right? And I do understand that there are individual differences here, but I do often see when I work with clients and they will say that thinness is a value for them, or they think it's a value for them, often more of an eating disorder value, right? And then when I ask them, first of all, they don't necessarily see thinness as something very important in other people, right? They don't necessarily see thinner bodies as prettier in general. It's just within themselves. And also they're not not above average appearance focused in other arenas, right? So you'll see an anorexic, for example, that is obsessed with thinness in themselves and obsessed about their weight, but they don't really care about the fact that their hair is falling out and their skin is dry. Anorexia is not exactly like a formula for beauty, right? It does not have an appearance boosting effect, let's just face it. How come this person that is, according to some theories of eating disorders, some theories that I disagree with, so concerned about their appearance and wanting to be thin to fit in, how come that this person does not care about brushing their hair or wearing nice clothes, right? And again, I know this is a generalization, and I know that they're just with any other individual variances, they're going to be people with eating disorders that are highly concerned about appearance in general. But you see this in the general population as well, right? So I don't necessarily see more appearance focus in people with eating disorders than the general population, right? Anyways, that was a little bit of a take for me before digging into this article. So I do want to say that there's quite a lot of points raised in the paper, and I actually have it next to me here. And I will not be able to touch upon everything in this study. That would just make the episode way too long. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to focus on the key takeaways and also what you can learn from this in terms of your own recovery and understanding yourself. And if you feel that it resonates, if you feel like, hey, this makes a lot of sense, then that's wonderful. So yeah, again, I'm not the author of this paper. That is Dr. Sean Guisinger. And like I said, you can find the paper online, have a read, and see what you think. Let's get started. So I'm just going to start with the abstract, just reading it quickly from the author's own words. It goes the following. Anorexia nervosa is commonly attributed to psychological conflicts, attempts to be fashionably slender, neuroendocrine dysfunction, or some combination of these factors. Considerable research reveals these theories to be incomplete. Psychological and societal factors account for the decision to diet, but not for the phenomenology of the disorder. Theories of biological defects fail to explain neuroendocrine findings that suggest coordinated psychological mechanisms. This article presents evidence that anorexia nervosa's distinctive symptoms of restricting food, denial of starvation, and hyperactivity are likely to be evolved adaptive mechanisms that facilitated ancestral nomadic foragers, leaving depleted environments. Genetically susceptible individuals who lose too much weight might trigger these archaic adaptations. This hypothesis accounts for the occurrence of anorexia-like syndromes in both humans and animals, and is consistent with changes observed in the physiology, cognitions, and behavior of patients with anorexia. Quote over. Wow, that was a lot of words, guys, and I probably mispronounced a few of these things. It's funny because there are certain words that I read more than I say, especially someone with English as my second language. Like, I never really, in everyday conversation with my friends, talk about the coordinated psychological mechanisms and ancestral nomadic foragers leaving depleted environments. Like, it's not really like a common conversation topic. So if there were some words there that were funnily pronounced, I do apologize. It's funny because I have so many English words that I mispronounce all the time, and nobody tells me because it's kind of like a douchebag move to like, hey, you're saying that word wrong, right? But my partner and maybe two of my friends will sometimes correct me, and I'm like, oh my God, I've said this word wrong for years and I didn't know. Okay, guys, anyways, now let's dig into the paper. I know I said that a few times, but now let's dig into the actual content. First of all, that abstract, what does that mean? So what it means essentially is that a lot of the behavior and a lot of what we see in anorexia nervosa actually can be a evolutionary adaptation to famine. What does that mean? Okay, so let's go back many, many years, thousands of years perhaps, God knows how many. But let's go back to when we were living in tribes. Of course, there are still, communities that are still living in these traditional tribes and hunter-gatherer tribes, right? We know that still exist, but most people don't do that anymore. But there was a time, long, long time ago, that we were all living like that. Think about the Stone Age, for example, right? We were living in these small little communities. We were hunting food, gathering food. And one thing that's been pretty consistent over the human history until very recently, at least in the developed countries, is food scarcity and periods of famine. This is just so ingrained in us that it would make complete sense that we have developed some mechanisms to actually cope with famine. And it also would make complete sense from an evolutionary perspective if different people respond slightly differently to famine so that the different roles to get out of famine can be best utilized. Essentially, what Dr. Guisinger is arguing is that people with anorexia, they essentially have a specific famine response, and it is actually genetic, specific famine response that's being triggered by a period of famine, whether it is actual famine, think back in the days when there was actual famine, or, what can I say, self-induced famine in terms of a diet, right? Or even something like ending up losing weight accidentally due to illness. I see a lot of times people with eating disorders, they explain that their eating disorder started after a period of illness, right, where they maybe lost some weight. So what's argued here is that the period of an energetic deficit, perceived famine, is activating an instinct in the people who have this genetic predisposition, right? Where they go into a specific mode, a specific adaptation to the energetic deficit, where instead of responding with eating more, right, which you would think would be a logical response, they are responding by the hunger goes down, activity goes up, and also denial of the fact that the person is starving, self-denial that, oh yeah, I'm not really starving, right? And some body blindness as well. You don't really see your own body realistically. So these are the key things Dr. Guisinger is talking about in this study. It is the denial of severity of illness and overall just denial that someone is underweight when someone is underweight, right? And denial of the starvation even happening. There could be some kind of awareness, right? But very often there is a lack of insight into the actual severity, and there's a lack of urgency, right? There is a lack of oh my God, I am dying. I need to correct this ASAP. There is a bit more of, it's not really that bad, right? You see this, denial is just such a key symptom of an eating disorder. So it's this is spoken about. And then it is also sometimes people with anorexia, they respond that actually starvation, instead of necessarily making them more hungry, it almost can turn down the hunger cues a bit, right? Of course, this can vary, and very often you'll see people with anorexia, which will also have periods with binge eating, which I also believe has an evolutionary response. I'll come back to that a bit later. But they may explain that, but when I'm restricting, I had much energy. I have felt urges to move, right? I'll very often, when I work with clients, I'll see that they will describe that if they have a period where they haven't eaten enough, they may notice that they get more hyperactive, right? They get stronger urges to move. And you would think this would make no sense because most people's reaction to starvation would be eating more and being more sluggish. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people with anorexia that don't experience the hyperactivity part, such as me, right? Instead, it can also manifest as more of like an inner restlessness. But it is true that many people with anorexia respond by urges to move with restriction. So yeah, you see these very paradoxical reactions to restriction in people with anorexia, right? And this is what Dr. Guisinger is arguing, that is actually an adaptation to famine. Why? So imagine that you have a group of people back in the days. Let's go back to the Stone Age, right? It would make complete sense that some people responded to famine by conserving energy, less movement, trying to eat as much as they could when food is available, right? It would also make complete sense that some people essentially, they, almost sacrifice themselves for the pack, right? They instead become more restless because they're detecting, oh my God, food is not available. We need to go out and hunt. We need to go out and gather. Got more energy to be able to do that. Also are able to be in some level of denial about the fact that they are dying of starvation, right? Because if they would be like, oh my God, I'm dying. Panicking, it makes complete sense. And it would also make sense if this group of people, would have this specific response to famine would also experience that their hunger actually can go down a bit, and almost like their hunger gets turned off. And some even describe that they feel like almost like they get a high or a reward from hunger. So basically, high on hunger would make complete sense to be high on hunger and a little bit in denial of how bad your health actually is. To be able to go out, hunt, gather, get the food, and then feed your pack and feed yourself. On a side note, I also wonder if this could account for the fact that so many people with anorexia are so obsessed with feeding others, right? You very often see that they get urges to feed the people around them. I remember myself, I had urges to feed my family. I would like cook and bake for them all the time. And I would also very specifically try and make the most high energy recipes I possibly could think of, because I felt so scared that my family was dying of hunger. And it was not any conscious, rational thought. It was more just, it felt like an instinct. It felt like some deep instinct inside me, right? So I guess evolutionary speaking, if my family went into starvation, I would be the one who would trying to feed them rather than, feeding myself and kind of sacrificing myself. So one thing that Dr. Sean Guisinger talks about is the fact that in eating disorder research, we have often assumed the wrong direction of causality, right? I'll read a quote here. What if researchers have assumed the wrong direction of causality? Several lines of evidence considered together suggest that rather than psychological or medical pathology causing the bizarre behaviors and cognitions of anorexia nervosa, it is the weight loss that leads to the symptoms. If the interpretation of the direction of causality is reconsidered, a number of discordant observations fall into place. So in the study, the author goes into some of the psychoanalytic theories of anorexia nervosa, and these have, they've almost been accepted as fact in the field of psychology. I would argue that there is not really much scientific basis behind these psychoanalytic theories. And overall here is a lot of theories about exercise being as a defense against depression, and that the eating disorder is kind of like like rebelling against the family. It discusses, controlling parents. Honestly, just to translate it, it essentially says anorexia nervosa happens because parents screw up, right? And it's interesting because one thing I see when working with people with anorexia is that they don't necessarily tend to come from more screwed up families than people without anorexia. If anything, I often see the opposite, right? Of course, there are going to be families where the parents are playing a big role in their child's development of anorexia. But again, there are so many families where we have controlling parents, right? Or we have distant parents or whatsoever. These things happen in plenty of families. I don't necessarily believe that it happens more in anorexic families or families where the child has anorexia. And a lot of the behavior that you see in parents, like described in the families and parents of people with anorexia, right? Typical example is controlling parents, right? Or hysteric parents, especially like really controlling mothers, hysterical mothers. I also wonder if these things are actually a perfectly normal response to your child starving themselves. I'm not a parent yet, but if I had a child that was starving themselves, I probably would have become a little bit controlling, right? I mean, I work with eating disorders, so maybe now I would have more awareness, right? But I think that the default response to your child starving themselves is, being a little bit controlling and neurotic around it, right? It's just kind of a logical response for most people. So yeah, that's a little side note from my thoughts around it. I wonder if a lot of the behavior that some of these researchers describe in families with anorexia is actually a response to the anorexia rather than the cause of the anorexia. Because I tend to see families that are very much supportive, and very often my clients will describe their family as like their biggest allies in recovery. Of course, no family is perfect, right? But again, you see this in families without anorexia nervosa too. So I think it may be family dynamics could be a contributing role in some cases, but I really don't think that is just like the be all end all. It's just caused by faulty families whatsoever, right? It just doesn't make any sense. There is no scientific basis around it, except some psychoanalysts 50 years ago were just sitting there debating, to be completely honest. So another thing that Dr. Sean Guisinger talks about is the kind of, the paradox that people with anorexia, they very often actually want to get better, right? I'm going to read something else from the study here. As noted, the DSM-IV-TR criteria for anorexia include a referral to maintain a normal body weight. However, rather than refusing to maintain a normal body weight, many patients, in my clinical experience, desperately want to be well, seeking treatment freely and sometimes at considerable financial and personal sacrifice. Yet they report enormous difficulty eating and refraining from exercise, as though something other than their conscious will were in charge of their behaviors, sensations, and cognitions. Quote over. This is so true. If anorexia was just a refusal to maintain, a healthy body weight, right? Then that wouldn't quite explain why so many people with eating disorders desperately want to get better. And I know this. I work with people with eating disorders, desperate to get better, willing to invest a lot of time, a lot of money into the healing process, right? Into the recovery. Another thing that Dr. Sean Guisinger argues in the study is that actually the desire for thinness was not necessarily, a motivational factor until recently. So it also is explained by Dr. Sean Guisinger that the intense fear of weight gain or becoming fat is not always characteristic for non-Western patients with anorexia. And also, it was not something that was even described when it comes to anorexia until around 1930. And also, the drive for thinness was not commonly described as a motivating factor until the 1960s. But despite that, we have seen anorexia since long before that. An example that's being described in the study is that during the Middle Ages, when many women fasted, some of the fasting women would develop something called holy anorexia. So essentially starving yourself in the name of God. But a fear of fatness was not described by these women. They had the typical anorexia symptoms such as aversion to food, overactivity, denial of starvation. So if we explain anorexia just by, society is full of diet culture and fat phobia, that wouldn't make quite sense because it was also present before that. But in today's society, there's virtue in thinness. And back then, there was virtue in, starving yourself in the name of God, right? And you also see moral rigidity in a lot of people with anorexia. And you see often that this worsens with undernourishment. And you see that this anorexia, this holy anorexia, as it's referred to here, it started after fasting, right? Or during fasting. So again, the energy deficit seemed to set off the behavior. And in modern society, modern Western society, some people fast, but most people don't fast. But going on a diet also creates an energetic deficit. So long story short, anorexia-like syndromes have existed since long before diet culture came into our world, right? But it could be that it's more common now because more people end up in an energetic deficit in the first place, because more people will go on a diet. When a diet, essentially what it does is that it puts you in a chronic energy deficit. If you're not quite buying this, oh my god, anorexia, you say it's been present since before diet culture? Nah, fake news. I want to remind you, as is in this study, is that you see similar thing in, wait for it, pigs and rats and several other animals, right? I think is really sad, but it's also quite fascinating. And understand that animal studies and human studies, they aren't, always the exact same. You can't necessarily look at something happening in an animal and be like, oh yeah, that means that it will happen in a human. But equally, if you see it happening in humans and animals, it is an interesting perspective, right? Because obviously pigs don't care about diet culture. Let's talk about anorexia in pigs, guys. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but this is a sentence that I never really thought I would say until I read this study. But yeah, so there are some pigs that are actually bred for extreme leanness, right? So basically skinny pig breeds. And what they are noticing is that pigs that are bred for extreme leanness, more specifically around 6% of pigs that are bred for extreme leanness, they develop something called wasting pig syndrome, aka pig anorexia. When I say they develop anorexia, I mean that they voluntarily start restricting their intake. Actually eat large amounts of straw for some reason, but they restrict their intake in general. A little bit like how people with anorexia sometimes will eat large amount of vegetables. Just saying. Interesting. But yeah, restricting their intake of normal, actually energetic food. And they also see that the pigs start becoming really restless. So in addition to the voluntary restriction, they start moving around more. They start becoming restless. And now let's talk about exercise-addicted rats. I should not laugh because it's actually really, really sad. But it's just a little bit funny when you say it out loud, okay? So, studies have shown that several mammal species develop anorexia-like symptoms in which they ignore their food and excessively exercise. This happens only if they are starved in the laboratory. So starvation induces anorexia-like symptoms in mammals. And this blew my mind when I read it, so I'm just going to read it for you guys. If feeding time is restricted and they have access to a running wheel, rats and 8 other rodent species will self-starve in the presence of food. Appetite also appears to be suppressed in wild animals when hunger and feeding compete with more important activities. Animals of many species stop eating even though food is readily available when they defend their harem or territory, incubate, molt, or migrate. Body weight may drop considerably as these animals actively pursue other agendas. Presumably, migrating animals do not eat and run because searching for food when it's scarce would interfere with migration. Quote over. This is so interesting. Think of it this way, right? You know when birds basically migrate from one place to another, right? They just have to fly. They can't be bothered by, hunting for food. They just autopilot fly. And this is a response to migration, right? And then eventually they come to a place where food is readily available and then they can start feasting, right? And then the study also continues explaining in more detail specifically what kind of hormones, what kind of neurotransmitters, etc., are at play in a person with anorexia. And also what they see is that a person with anorexia who's starved will respond very differently psychologically and also just down on a biological level than a person without anorexia during the period of starvation, but also in the refeeding process. Some examples is that the hormone leptin in people with anorexia tends to restore a little bit prematurely, which can create some challenges in recovery because leptin basically regulates body weight and hunger. And this is why a lot of people in eating disorder recovery notice that they feel full early, right? And that actually putting on weight to the set point weight range starts becoming challenging, especially if they are consistently eating rather than being in that binge restrict cycle that so many people end up in. This does not happen in everyone, but it does happen in some people. And you see in anorexic rats, they also feel full quite quickly, and so does anorexic individuals. Yet it also, very, very interestingly, can exist the complete opposite, sometimes in the same person. The same person who feels full early can also be someone who's in a binge restrict cycle and then binges without really feeling full, or feeling full but still have the drive to eat. And basically the study also discusses, the fact that people with anorexia, they are really hungry and really full at the same time. Essentially, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect, right? Where the hunger hormones a little bit out of whack, right? So you see a person with anorexia may be extremely food obsessed. This is actually a form of mental hunger, right? This is a form of food obsession that you see in people with anorexia over and over. Of course, again, not absolutely everyone, but in the majority. So can you see how many seemingly opposites that exist in the same time with anorexia, right? Someone can get a high from starvation, yet at the same time be extremely food obsessed and find eating to be extremely rewarding, and even find that certain foods that for most people wouldn't taste good taste really good for them, right? I remember some of the disgusting things I ate during my anorexia that for me tasted good. This is why I don't trust people when they're eating egg white pancakes. Like, your taste buds are ruined due to restriction. Come on, this is not tasty. This tastes like crap. It tasted good during my anorexia, does not taste good now. So what is important here when it comes to the part with hyperactivity, right, is that this is not invariably present throughout the illness, to quote Dr. Sean Guisinger, but more so that it can present at different times and in different ways. Here, Dr. Sean Guisinger goes back a bit to what I spoke about with, the adaptation to Flee Famine, right? The adaptation to migrate. And essentially, Dr. Sean Guisinger says that anorexics' hyperactivity may be a form of migratory restlessness. And back to the anorexic rats again, guys. Many species increase activity in times of food shortage. Seasonal migratory restlessness is common in birds and mammals. And researchers have long known that depriving laboratory rats of food increases wheel running. Laboratory rats normally run less than 1 kilometer a day, but if they're starved and then maintained at 70% under normal weight, they run up to 20 kilometers per day. So, quote over. But to paraphrase, these starved rats can maintain extraordinary activity levels for up to 90 days. And then the more weight they lose, the more hyperactive they become. It means that losing around 30% of their body weight is something that creates the peak activity. And they see if they put a running wheel into a lab rat's cage, and they restrict their meals, the rat will start running more and more on the wheels until it run itself to death. Are you sure that your sudden obsession with running is just, oh, I love the endorphins? Or are you basically like a starved little laboratory rat that's just running on the wheel? So there are some very important takeaways here. So first of all, it's just that the starvation can create hyperactivity in many humans and also animals. And also it seems that weight plays a role here, right? So being underweight, being under your, normal set point weight creates these symptoms. And this is why part of why I believe that weight restoration to well into your healthy range is absolutely crucial. So many people think, oh, well, I can recover from anorexia, but I'll stay in a lower weight, right? Because why would I gain weight? It's a mental disorder. I'll just change my behaviors, do a bit of rewiring. No, there is biology at play here, right? You need to restore to your set point weight range. If you're staying at a too low weight, you will probably notice that certain symptoms, such as the urges to move specifically, will not really go away. I've seen this so many times when I work with clients, is that if they, for example, have like a bit of a crazy day where they weren't able to get enough food, they will very often explain that they suddenly feel like their urges to move become stronger. If they have a restricted period, urges to move goes up, which is very paradoxical. And of course, again, not everyone. I personally did not experience much of this. I think I experienced more like an inner restlessness. And when I say urges to move, this does not have to be literally going for a sprint, right? This could also literally just be walking, not wanting to sit down, pacing around, always wanting to do something around the house. Oh yeah, let's clean out the wardrobe. Let's wash the floor, right? And also just a general discomfort with not doing this activity, right? It's almost like something feels wrong on such a deep primal level for you not moving. So to move on in the study, it also talks about denial of illness and delusional body image. So I want to quote from the study once again, because I think this sums up and also sums up some of the things that I was explaining a bit earlier when I was quickly summarizing the key takeaways of the studies. Those starving foragers who deceived themselves about their desperate physical condition and believing they were healthy, confidently moved on, may have survived at higher rates than those who despaired when accurately assessing their starved condition. So basically, to simplify that, realizing that, oh no, I am really, really thin. I am starved. I think my body is shutting down. Whoopsie, I'm going to panic. That would maybe not be super beneficial when you are in a acute mode where you need to go and hunt for food, right? A little bit of delusion, a little bit of not needing to eat, a little bit of, urges to move. Again, can you see how much sense that makes from an evolutionary perspective? It also discusses just the fact that self-deception is a very typical, coping mechanism for us human beings. You see this in other conditions, for example, drug addiction, alcoholism, right? There tends to be some level of self-deception. I think this is absolutely fascinating, because I think that the whole myth that people with anorexia have no idea that they have anorexia is not necessarily accurate, right? But there tends to be some kind of level of, it's not that bad, right? I see this over and over. No matter how sick someone is, it's still like, it's not that bad, right? I will have people with full-blown eating disorders that I work with who'll be like, what if I don't have an eating disorder? What if I fake it? What if I make it up? To which I respond, okay, then if you're just doing it for fun or making it up, then just stop then, right? And then they realize how hard that is, that they can't just stop. That's how you know you have an eating disorder. So to move forward a little bit, the author also discusses basically that anorexia seems to be a evolutionary adaptation, and it is a genetic thing, and that most people don't necessarily have this genetic predisposition, which explains why most people who go on a diet don't develop anorexia. And I think this is very helpful to remember, right? If you think of it this way, you have a genetic predisposition that means that you are literally allergic to dieting. Does not matter if your cousin or your aunt or your uncle or whatsoever are going on diets. It does not matter what they're doing because you can't do it. It's literally just how, I love peanut butter, but as a person with a peanut allergy can't eat peanut butter, doesn't matter that I eat peanut butter. It's not something that they can do. They're allergic to peanuts. And realizing that you have a genetic predisposition, which means that you can never diet again, I know that can be scary. I know it can be part of it, can have some people might have some grief towards that. But also, can you see it as an extreme relief? Because that means that whatever diet culture stuff is going on there, you just can't do it. You're allergic. Because you have a specific response to an energetic deficit that puts you in a certain state that is not productive for well-being. This is not to say that the people who don't have this genetic predisposition should diet. I could make a whole episode about why that is just not the answer anyways. But it does explain why your friend can go on like a juice diet for a week and then just not go absolutely nuts like us with a genetic predisposition do. I've been recovered for a decade now. Yeah, close to a decade. And I still know that if I for some reason was forced to severely restrict my intake, I know that certain thoughts and behaviors would creep up in me. I know that my rigidity would skyrocket. I know that I would maybe start getting a little bit of a high from not eating, which is so scary to admit, but I know that that is something that in my genes, it's there. Because my brain is basically falsely rewarding me for starvation, right? Which is also touched upon more in detail in the paper if someone is interested. This is also why I believe that, when you are in recovery, and also when you are recovered, you need to make sure that you don't end up in situations where there is an energetic deficit, because you may not handle that as well as other people. So of course, never dieting again, very important. But also I want you to be careful when you, for example, if you have a stomach bug, right? If you get food poisoning, or something happens that make you lose your appetite, could be grief or depression, Be careful and be alert and focus on mechanical eating if your appetite disappears. Because again, other people, they may have a stomach bug, not eating enough for a few days, and they don't notice anything. They just go back to eating like nothing happened. And of course that can happen with you, right? But it could also be that could be enough to set off something. I do not believe that an eating disorder is a chronic illness that you can never recover from, but I do believe it's a chronic vulnerability. Thankfully, I do notice that now, 10 years in recovery, I'm not as vulnerable as I used to be. For example, I think that it would have taken me more to get into that famine state, right? I think missing a meal is not really going to send me straight into it. If anything, now I notice when I miss a meal, I just get kind of grumpy, hungry. I just feel like eating, right? But I remember in recovery, if I, for example, overslept a bit for a meal, I could sometimes feel like, ooh, almost like get a bit endorphins by this. Oh, should I maybe just, not eat it? And this is also why being at a weight where you're not just balancing on the bare minimum is so important, right? Because if you are balancing on the bare minimum, it takes very little for you to lose weight to, get into that starvation mode again. This is why I recommend for people to go well into the set point weight range. And I think it's absolute negligence that some treatment professionals tell people, oh yeah, just go to a BMI of 18.5 and just stay there because then you're officially quote unquote normal weight, where for most people that is far, far less than their set point weight. I'm so glad that I was encouraged to gain well into the healthy weight range, because we do also see studies saying that actually gaining well into that range, restoring weight to an appropriate amount, it does serve as something that reduces the risk of relapse. This is also touched upon in the study. Essentially, Dr. Guisinger does explain that when someone comes just out of recovery, it's like they are almost in a space where they're ready to migrate again. Just quote what it says here. Neuropsychologically, short-term recovered anorexics appear ready to migrate again. The neuroendocrine changes that facilitate hyperactivity and food refusal return to normal only slowly after weight is regained. What this means is that the desire to exercise and restrict foods, especially fats, will remain high, and it's easy for the weight restored patient to lose weight once he or she is out of an inpatient setting. So again, you tend to be more vulnerable when you're fresh out of recovery, right? But then it tends to normalize more slowly with time. And you see this with a lot of things when in eating disorder recovery, right? Certain things take longer to restore and normalize than others. The part of regaining weight is sometimes the easier part, right? Of course, not saying that is always easy, and I understand there can be even physical complications from that as well, like hypermetabolism, right, which I've discussed in a previous episode. But things such as, everything restoring to normal, restoring to factory settings, to put it that way, that can happen sometime after recovery. We also see that metabolism tends to be elevated in, I think it's the 3 to 6 months after recovery as well. So you may have a higher energy need after recovery. And I would also argue that if you are one of the people who realize that you can never diet again and you just eat consistently, naturally your metabolism will benefit compared to if you are someone who goes yo-yo dieting. We know that that negatively impacts metabolism. So it would make sense that a recovered anorexic who is very consistent with their intake, consistent with eating enough, versus someone who quote unquote recovers but end up in the binge restrict cycle where they're just constantly in that famine mode, would make sense that there would be metabolic differences here. And not to mention, I would argue that the latter, if you quote unquote recover from anorexia, but you just end up in a cycle where you're constantly restricting, you're not really recovered. That's still an eating disorder. Anyways, guys, this is becoming a very long episode. And there are so many other things in the study that I could have gone into more detail about, but I simply don't have time. And I know that this is a lot of information and it can be a bit overwhelming as well. So yeah, because this episode is so long, I will not take a listener question for this episode because it's kind of dragging over the 40-minute mark now. And I try to keep my episode to 20-30 minutes. So yeah, as mentioned, if you want to read the study in its full, then Google Adapted to Flee Famine, Dr. Sean Guisinger, and it should be available somewhere online. Also, just quick side note, I am in no way affiliated with Dr. Sean Guisinger or anything like that. I just generally find it a very interesting study. Also, if you like this episode and, digging into a scientific article, I have done a similar episode discussing the Minnesota starvation study, which I also believe is an extremely important study in understanding eating disorders. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. Okay, guys, have a wonderful week ahead, and I hope to see you guys next week.